fail fast. And what I mean by fail fast, you guys have probably heard this many times, but for me, it means that you don't just try everything and then fail, quick and then just change and pivot. You take a mindful approach to decision making, but once you make a decision, then you don't wait to change paths. Like, you'll know your backup path and your backup of your backup path, and you'll switch quick. I can't tell you how many times I've seen companies, entrepreneurs fail who keep doubling and tripling down on a really, really bad idea rather than just admit it's a bad idea and just moving on to the backup plan.
Welcome to another episode of Zero to Exit. This is Ankur and Lima. We took a bit of a hiatus from our scheduled programming for a number of reasons. One of the big ones was the time it took to get today's guest on the podcast, something we have been looking forward to for a long time. So without further ado, let me welcome the man, the myth, the legend in the security industry, Stuart McClure. Stuart was the founder and CEO of Cylance, the first endpoint security company that revolutionized the way industry detects and protects endpoint using machine learning. He's also the co-author of the most successful security book series of all time, Hacking Exposed. Prior to founding Cylance, Stu ran the security business at McAfee, co-founded Foundstone, and held leadership role at small and large security companies. He's now a board member and advisor for many security companies. If you're an entrepreneur or a security professional, there's nothing else you'd rather be doing at this time than listening to this podcast. Hi, Stu. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. So there's so much ground to cover today that I'm going to get right down to business. I believe you grew up in Guam. Tell us what your upbringing was like and the lessons you learned growing up.
Yeah, I was born in Los Angeles area, but grew up very quickly at a young age in Guam. And my family was not in the military. That's the often next question. Why would anybody move their family to Guam? But it was really a great place for me to grow up. I certainly struggled, as a minority in school, of course, and on the playground. But you got to learn life's lessons pretty quickly and get to know how to negotiate the world pretty quickly. So it ended up being a really, really strong part of my past. I also learned and discovered my passion for cycling. So road cycling was out in Guam. It ended up that I figured out, hey, I can escape from the wild dogs and the bullies on a bicycle really, really fast and really well and easily. So I was able to get on that bike and just escape and get out there. And it's a small island, so I could go around that whole island within a day, and it was really good for me to get out. And I also found a nice sort of aerobic outlet for my energy, which as a young man and young adult, that was really nice to have. And it also led me to Colorado, which is where I went to train at the Olympic Training Center in 1985 for road cycling. So everything happens for a reason, and that was certainly no exception, that experience in Guam.
I remember we discussed the story about the airplane incident when you were in college. The incident decades later would help you with some of the core principles as you were building Cylance product. Can you talk a little bit about that incident?
Yeah, sure. I was a sophomore in college up at CU Boulder, and my mother had offered for myself and my younger brother, 10 years younger brother, Mark, to go to Australia. And we had never been, and we had free tickets to Australia because my stepfather worked for United at the time. And I thought, what could go wrong? It sounds like a fantastic trip.
Yeah.
So I took a week off or so from college, or I think it was during a break. It was last week of February, and went on the flight. And from LA to Honolulu was no problem. A perfect flight up and down. It was a late night flight, so we landed around 1 a.m. if I recall correctly. and then we took off about 2 a.m. And at that time, I fell asleep. I was comfortable. We were in our seats. We took over one middle part of one row, and I was on the right hand side of that part. And sure enough, within about 10-15 minutes, you had huge explosion, rapid decompression, and everything that wasn't bolted down just left the plane. And unfortunately, 9 souls were lost on that flight that night. But we didn't know that at the time. We just thought that, with Lockerbie, like a year before, we thought it was a bombing.
Mhm.
And we thought for sure
Wow.
that, here we are over the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Don't know how far away, because we were, ascending it, I want to say, for about 15, 20 minutes, and didn't know where we would end up. Would we end up in the water? Would we make it back somehow? And, the whole experience and memory was just total chaos of everybody trying to figure out, this is how we're going to die. And so how do you end up dying? And all of us were really surprised when we started to hear people notice lights, because it was pitch black. Remember, it's 2:30 in the morning. You really
Yeah.
can't see anything out the window. And you start to hear, hey, lights, there's lights, there's lights. So that gave us hope that, hey, we're close to land. Maybe there's a chance that we can land on the ground and not in the ocean. And then what I remember is the pilot or somebody saying 2 minutes to touchdown. And I just remember thinking, oh, that's really good sign, right? Touchdown. It's not splashdown. I kept thinking, but you just don't know. You don't know where you are. You're in the middle of nowhere. I mean, total blackness everywhere. And somehow that pilot, who it was his second to last flight before retirement with United Airlines, it was mandatory retirement age.
Mhm.
He was able to land that plane, and it was the most perfect landing I've ever been on in my life, before or since. Because I thought for sure
Wow.
we would do cartwheels, even if we got to land. We would do somehow cartwheels, and it would just be debris everywhere. But we landed, the plane stopped. We got off of that plane within 45 seconds. It's like 320 or 40 passengers off in 45 seconds. It was crazy. And yeah, then we got interviewed with the FBI by the FBI, thinking that it was a bomb. And we really didn't know what the heck happened. We just knew that there was a huge hole in the side of the plane. And so I get back after the whole experience, get back to college, and I'm actually I used to work many jobs, of course, as a typical entrepreneur would, but I was an assistant teacher at a daycare center. And I'll never forget it. I was walking between classrooms, and I just thought to myself, like, why would I ever choose to be unhappy again? Like, life is
Yeah.
just way too short. It still, even to this day, feels almost like a dream that I'm living versus the real world, the real thing.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty common for near death experiences. But yeah, it shaped a lot about who I am as a person, and obviously as a professional. It created a lot of motivation for me to do the right thing, to make the right choices, to think outside myself, which is, as a 19-year-old, it's hard to do, but it taught me that pretty quick. And that's carried me throughout my life.
Yeah, pretty incredible story. It's interesting you mentioned that the I guess the captain was about to retire. Didn't the same thing happen with Captain Sully as well? I guess that experience led him to the retirement, but like it was his tail end of his career as well, and but wow,
It
this
helps. It
yeah.
helps. I really do think that you get almost muscle memory in trying to respond to things, that you need to react within milliseconds, not within seconds. And if you don't take those actions, I think as a pilot, you have the real potential for disaster. And I think that's what saved us for sure. I mean, he was a 30-year glider pilot,
Hmm.
Mhm.
Captain David Cronin. He was out of Incline Village, Nevada, and yeah, he was 30-year glider pilot. So he knew how to glide. So in the plane, what happened was the debris that had blown out went into the number 3 and 4 engine. And so he had to shut those two engines down. And I think to this day, no 747 plane has ever landed successfully with only two engines working on one side. And so I remember I actually asked my stepfather to get me in contact with the pilot because I really just wanted to ask him one question. How did you get us down? Because I see all the news articles about it where, impossible flight, there's no way it could have, made it back, etc. How did the captain do it? So I got his number. I nervously called him up. I was totally undeserving of calling him, but I called him and I said, look, I don't want to bother you. And I just want to say thank you for, saving us all. But I really need to know, how did you make it back? And he goes, Stuart, I'll tell you something. I have no idea. He's like, I have no idea. And I go, what do you mean? He's like, well, when we got on the ground, the NTSB and Boeing, all of us, we pulled the black box. We put it in flight simulators there in Honolulu. And we tried over 200 different attempts, and I couldn't repeat it. I couldn't repeat landing. We crashed in the ocean every single time in the simulator. So he's like, I have no idea. So I said,
Yeah,
you know what? That's all I need to hear. I know my mission. Okay, got to make the most of life.
and you had mentioned that it was a known flaw.
Yes, yes. So about a year afterwards, they had been performing an investigation, and it had been discovered that there was two elements of the failure. So the first was sort of an accident, right? So it's a short in the wire. So you could probably argue that's a design flaw. Maybe you need to design in that sort of failure. But the second backup element, which is a hooking mechanism that's supposed to hold the door even if it does open in mid-flight, was a severe design flaw because that was made of aluminum and the door was made of steel. So imagine under pressure,
Yeah.
that steel door getting blown out, it just turned that aluminum to butter. It never really held the door whatsoever. So again,
Mhm.
a couple of design flaws, certainly vulnerabilities in the fuselage of that plane. And I think that also really inspired me to apply that sort of mindset to cyber as well. So being able to think ahead and think like a bad guy, think like somebody that's trying to bypass controls and exploit vulnerabilities and get to what they want, and how I could try to apply that mindset knowledge to preventing real suffering in the world, in particular online. And I think that's what gave me a lot of inspiration early on to go into computers and cyber in particular.
Let me go back to your little bit early life. Right after college, you started a consulting company and then became a columnist at InfoWorld. And somewhere around that time, you also co authored the first edition of Hacking Exposed. Why did you decide to write a book on security?
Well, the book idea, I think like most people, you always think to yourself, God, wouldn't it be the ultimate in existence if you could just publish a book, right?
Yeah.
Man, you really have made it if you can be a book author. And so I had always had that in the back of my head. But I had been writing obviously for magazines and certain, pieces here and there. And I had also been focused almost solely on computer security at the time of at InfoWorld, and I was covering that industry for a number of years. And I had been learning a lot about how the bad guys were getting in to computer systems and networks, and I had been really documenting them so that I could remember them, and also I could talk about them in columns and pieces and write-ups and such. And obviously I would test out each one of these that I possibly could to see how they're really doing it. I, of course, had my computer science background, and I also had a cyber incident while I was at CU Boulder around the Morris worm. So that gave me a lot of background and comfort around the subject. And so, as I'm documenting all these particular attacks, one day I'm like, gosh, I could probably write a book on this topic. And I had already been writing a bunch of columns in the security watch column at InfoWorld that I started with Joel. And so I just said, "Hey, I'm going to write a book." And I actually first asked my boss at the time. His name was Bob Garza, if he wanted to join me, and it would just be him and I writing the book, because he had been an author of a Lotus Notes book.
Mhm.
And I thought, oh, he knows the drill. He can get me covered, and we'll just co-author it together. Well, he just refused me. He's like, "Look, I'm too busy. A book is an absolute total nightmare. You never want to write a book. Don't ever write a book." And so I
That's
said,
very
"Oh,
encouraging.
it was very encouraging. Thanks, Bob." To this day, well, to this day, he still kicks himself in the butt for
Yeah.
not saying yes on this one. But at any rate, so my colleague Joel, who was working with me at the time, I said, "Hey, you want to co-author a book with me? I'm going to pitch it," because I had done some technical reviewing of another book for Windows 95 at the time, and I said, "Hey, let's try and pitch it together." And so I had written up a table of contents, and I shipped it off to them. Of course, they rejected us, first time, and I, of course, undeterred, just kept sort of pitching it out to everybody. Well, about a year later, they came back. The very original pitch rejection came back and said, "Hey, uh, are you still interested in writing this book? Because we just hired a new editor, and they've got time now to work on this." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, yeah, of course." So that's how it all came to be. So Joel and I started writing it while still at InfoWorld, and then I got recruited over to Ernst and Young, and finished it while I was there at Ernst and Young, and then left almost right after the book was published and started Foundstone.
Very cool. Um, I should mention that I am guilty of not having read the book, but then after our conversation, I downloaded the seventh edition. I'm like halfway through it. One of the things that struck me about the book was it's almost as if you wanted to write it for yourself or like your 10-year-old. It's very simple. It builds. It doesn't. It's not jargony. It starts simple and then builds different concepts on top of that. um you know in it's very first principles type book before first principle became a thing. Is this how you generally think about different subjects, people, organization, scaling? Like not be held hostage by dogmas, but start think bottoms up and then build.
I've always been, yeah, it's a great observation. I mean,
Yeah.
I've always believed that unless you can explain it to a 4-year old, you really don't understand the material, and you really
Mhm.
shouldn't even try to explain it. And I also believed at the time there was really only 3 or 4 cyber books out before I published this book, and it was Halting the Hacker was one, Secrets of the Super Hacker was another, Maximum Security was another, and I think there was one more, but I'm drawing a blank on it. But none of them, if you pull those things up and you could get your hands on any one of them, none of them were sort of recipe driven, prescriptive driven.
Mm.
And I don't know if you're a baker, but like baking science by
Yeah.
and large, right? You do this and then this in this order, and it comes out pretty much perfect pretty much every time, right? And I thought to myself, like, gosh, why can't we create, cybersecurity more like a science? Like, do this, then this, and you're going to get this result. And I'm also a kinetic learner. I'm sure if I got tested, I've got 20 different learning disabilities because I cannot read something. I can't.
Mm.
It has to be, I have to actually do it. And so I thought to myself, well, I think the most foundational way everybody learns is kinetically by doing. So why don't I make this book more of a kinetic, recipe driven, prescriptive process for people, but make it as available and open as possible to everybody out there. And so that was the design from the very beginning. And luckily, we were able to get a nice template together for every chapter to make sure that they looked and sounded uh, similar and came across exactly the same. And then, of course, that book then exploded into a whole bunch of other books in the hacking exposed. So the Hacking Exposed book itself became a whole franchise, and
Yep.
it sort of got way out of control, to be quite honest with you all.
As
But
I was telling Ankur, a lot of us engineers who used to do hacking grew up on that book. So it's a Bible for us.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Thank you for
Now
writing
it's
that
more like a paperweight, but yeah, back in the day, everybody had it on their desk,
Oh,
and
totally.
it was an easy meeting with 90% of everybody in the cybersecurity industry, that first meeting, because you tell them about you're the author of that book, and they'd be like, "What? Oh, I have that book," or "I love that book," or "I've been studying that book forever."
Yeah.
So it made it really a nice, easy meeting icebreaker for sure.
Yeah, I can't remember how many times I've given talks on like Tor exit nodes and stuff, and like I'm reading yesterday, I'm like, oh, it's actually the onion ring, and okay, I think it makes sense because there are layers and layers,
Yeah,
and I think one of the things that you mentioned early on in the book is like read every page, and that
yeah,
is true because you miss this fundamental concepts, you're not going to get the advanced stuff.
yeah.
So you co-authored Hacking Exposed, and then also co-founded Foundstone, and were also an exec with another superstar like yourself, George Kurtz, who is the CEO of CrowdStrike. How did you know each other? Obviously, you've done many years of work together.
He originally go way, way back. He originally sent me a couple emails while I was at InfoWorld because he
Yep.
wanted something he was working on at PwC to be written about, in the magazine. And then he invited me out to a Windows hacking class out in Cleveland, Ohio. I'll never forget that. That was sort of fun. And then he recruited me along with John Darbyshire over to Ernst and Young because they were going from PW to Ernst and Young to build the cybersecurity practice there. That was largely out of Kansas City, Missouri. And so I helped them all build the foundations for that program. And we, of course, George and I worked together, pretty much every day for something like 12 or 13 years. So yeah, I got to know each other very, very well. And we're very successful together. And, we had Foundstone together. We started that company.
Yep.
And, it was a great experience. And then with McAfee, we just took it to the next level and just had a great team there.
Going to McAfee, you were at McAfee for many years, running the enterprise, risk and compliance business. A lot of founders we interview on the pod are McAfee alums. Um, like the PayPal mafia looks like in security, we have a McAfee mafia in the industry. What made
Mhm.
McAfee such a perfect breeding ground for future entrepreneurs in the security world?
It's funny that you say that about McAfee Mafia, but I was just thinking that like a year ago or something. I was like, there are a lot, DeCesar, and I mean, there's just DeWalt, of course, and
Yeah.
Yeah,
everybody has gone on to do something,
Yeah.
either as first-time entrepreneurs to start a company or to CEO a company, or multiple time. And we had this phenomenon at Foundstone as well. I mean, I remember stopping counting at about 26 companies that Foundstone had birthed. In other words, first time entrepreneurs that were Foundstone alum. And I think, obviously we had a lot of that with McAfee as well. I think that, especially under Dave DeWalt, he was just a master at bringing talent together and acquiring, being acquisitive successfully. And you all know how challenging acquisitions can be
yeah.
on so many different dimensions and levels. And they're most often failures, to be quite honest, by almost any measure, whether it be financial or cultural or, logistical or whatever you want to, measure them by. But I honestly look back on all the acquisitions that we did, including, Foundstone was acquired by McAfee, and I look at it and I struggle for more than a handful that you would consider less than super successful. And so I think that came to, DeWalt and DeCesar and the whole team building the right executive team, looking for the right technologies, and then being successful and bringing them and their founders and their engineers, employees together, and proving that it can be done, that you can you can turn around a company. Because I don't know if you remember the history, but McAfee it wasn't the shining star, let's put it to you that way, in
Yep.
cybersecurity at the time. And I
Mhm.
won't name names and go into the details, but DeWalt was a bright light, and it was the reason why I came back to McAfee. I actually left McAfee. I helped a buddy build the cybersecurity practice at Kaiser Permanente, and they came back and asked me to come back and join because DeWalt had joined, and I was so impressed with him and knew that he had the right vision and the right execution, and so it ended up, I think, just it's a collection of talent that we were just super blessed to have been there at that time, and we could parlay, and it's really what allowed me to focus on endpoint and focus on prevention. So
Yeah.
for me, there was just so many blessings of that whole experience.
We absolutely need to get Dave DeWalt on the, if he will come on the pod, it will be just awesome.
Well, I'm sure he would. He just went public with Night Dragon, so
Yeah.
yeah, with the SPAC. So I'm sure he would be more than willing to chat with you.
Okay, we will request you to do the intros too. Thank you.
Happy to do that. Yeah, for sure.
So from there, from McAfee, you went to Kaiser for some time, but then you started Cylance. How did the idea came about for the Cylance?
Well, so I had taken the CTO title, the global CTO title, and I had been thrust sort of into the world of managing large product portfolios that some were new, but most were old, antiquated. They had been built 20 plus 30 years ago.
Mhm.
And I had also been, obviously, as that senior executive, been asked to fly around the world, meet with every customer, and I used to get the same three questions pretty much every single time, almost in exactly the same order. You know, why is your product so slow? Why doesn't it stop anything? And why aren't you innovating? I mean, that was it. And I'm sure you guys can resonate, right? And when you get
Yeah.
out there with customers, it's pretty much the top three. And so I used to jokingly say I'm more the chief apology officer than anything else. That's what I would do is I would apologize for what I had sort of inherited. But I would reassure them and give them a solid vision and roadmap plan for improvements and innovation. But I knew deep down inside that I couldn't do at least one of those effectively, and that is to really prevent attacks. Because we all know how signature based approaches work. And the very nature of signature based technologies is you can never actually prevent something brand new, almost never. You can only prevent that which the world has already seen before and already built a signature to detect. And so I just kept thinking, like, with such guilt, as I'm explaining to everybody, like, we are moving forward to do this. I knew that we really couldn't fully prevent cyber attacks, especially 0 days, but I knew that there had to be a way. And I went back to my old days in college in programming, computer science, where I was fascinated with decision tree learning.
Hmm.
And I wasn't strong in maths, but I was strong in algorithms and programming. So I could build an algorithm. I just couldn't reduce its time by 100x or something like that. But I knew that there was a way to teach a computer to learn, and that's what really sparked my interest, was to say, well, look, we have a known database of literally hundreds of millions, if not billions, of viruses and trojans and malware. Why couldn't we take all of those and break them down into their characteristic parts and features and qualities, and teach a computer to learn which features and qualities and characteristics are most predictable of malicious and which ones are most predictable of good. And at first, of course, it was hard to explain it to anybody because nobody had
Yeah.
applied machine learning like that or data science into cybersecurity.
Yeah.
The closest thing that you could make an argument for was in the early days of spam filtering. They had some semblance of machine learning in those approaches, but they never reached commercial success. They just couldn't get them fast enough and accurate enough. And so you get up a whole bunch of legitimate emails that were thrown into spam, and vice versa. You'd miss spam that go in the inbox. So I knew that there was some potential for this, and I just knew in my gut that we could do this in a far more efficient, effective manner, especially given the large data sizes that we were working with at the time. And so that was the impetus behind Cylance, was that we could not just um, detect a problem and stop it, but we could predict it and prevent it. And that was the ultimate maturity and evolution of machine learning, was to move away just from classification to prediction,
Hmm.
and to do it in real time. And that was the biggest challenge, because you think about every single thing that executes on a computer. I mean, we're talking milliseconds of time. So you have to get whatever decision making that's in the way and shimmed in between that process to make a decision within 100 milliseconds, or you're going to overwhelm the computer and no customer will ever buy you. So we had a couple of really big challenges to solve for. But once we solved for those, about a year and a half in to Cylance, we knew we were onto something really, really special, and we could get um, basically an intelligent mind on the computer in real time to look at everything before it executes or opens and determine if it's going to be malicious. And that process is what I had been doing as a cybersecurity professional forever, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'll never forget. I'm embarrassed. I'm going to tell you the story, but it's a known story, so I think I'm comfortable repeating it. So right after McAfee bought Foundstone, they put me on the road to go and talk about the technology and host a whole bunch of events. And one of them was in Rochester at RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology. And I'll never forget this, because it was one of the first talks right after the acquisition. And at the end, in almost every presentation I ever did, I always did a live demo, because I always thought that was the best way for people to learn. Like, look at this attack. Like, let me show you how it works. Well, at the end of it all, I had somebody in the back row of the audience ask a question, and he goes, "Hey, Stu, I know you just got acquired by McAfee, but I'm just curious, what what do you use on your computer that protects you from hackers? I mean, you must be a pretty big target. You got the Hacking Exposed book. I'm sure somebody would love to put a trophy of your face on their mantle of somebody that they hacked. So, what do you use?" And I remember pausing, because I just thought to myself, like, McAfee just, paid decent money for my company. And, here I am about to admit that I don't use any product. In fact, I would never use a product of any sort, right?
Yeah.
I just don't trust them. They just aren't good. And it sort of creates this laissez-faire attitude to doing something. Whereas I'd rather, you have nothing to protect you on the computer. Now go work on the internet, right? So, and I looked down at the front row, and sure enough, it was the head of worldwide sales for McAfee in the audience. And I thought to myself, oh man, I'm either going to lie to 1,000 people, there's about 1,000 in the audience, or I'm going to be the shortest tenured executive of McAfee history, because I just got acquired. And so I look up to the guy and I go, because he asked me, hey, can you show me your computer screen, your sys tray? And I'm like, look, I don't need to show you my sys tray. I'll tell you exactly what I have on here. I have nothing on here. I mean, but I just want to remind everybody, like, I'm not 99.9% of the world. Like, I know what to click on and what not to. I know what to open and what not to. I know what settings to set in the operating system at a low level to prevent sort of the low hanging fruit of attacks. And so I know all these things, and that's not what most people do. They don't do that, every day in and day out. So they do need some protection. That's why McAfee's perfect. Well, of course, in the back of my head, I'm like, I got to fix this problem, because this is embarrassing, because I can't even endorse the very product that I was a part of. And I've got to try and make this better. And so that really set me on my path to try and predict and prevent cyber attacks more effectively.
One more thing that was unique about Cylance was it was a cloud managed console, first of its kind on for an endpoint product. What was the thought process behind that?
Well, the cloud, there were two major architectural decisions that we had to make. One was, where do we do the training, right, for the models? We could get a whole bunch of GPUs, we could get a whole bunch of big irons, or we could use the cloud. That was the first decision, right? EC2 and Amazon AWS was coming out. That was first. And second was, where do we host our console? Do we host it in the cloud, or do we have it on prem, or do we offer for both? And we had a lot of very spirited debates and discussions around it, but ultimately realized there was no way that we could stand up our own private cloud, economically effectively anyway, to deliver on what we needed to deliver on with regard to machine learning and data science training. So that was an easier decision. Second one was, yeah, where do we put this console? If we sell to the U.S. government, they're never going to take a public cloud over their dead body. So, or even some of the big banks. Like, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in with big banks. They're like, it'll never happen, never happen.
Yeah.
And so we had to make a decision. Do we appease the big giants to get them as customers, or do we craft and build the technology for the masses? Do we allow for the 80-20 rule? Like, are we covering 80% with our technology? Then that's what we're going to do. And so we went with the cloud. Ended up being a great decision.
Yes.
We did have an on-premise solution at one point, but honestly, I think we even ditched that in the end and just said, look, if the technology is not compelling enough for you to overlook the cloud, having the console, then it's okay. Like, there's a lot of other great products out there. Go for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it all worked out in the end.
One of the things you talked about was training data sets. So one of the banes of the security industry has been just not enough training data sets to do supervised machine learning. How did you get that? Like, is it just sort of unsupervised, get the attack, learn from that? Or were you able to get some copies of data from, historical data set? I mean, nowadays, Congress and everybody's talking about, you know, um, uh, companies to come clean with, if they have been breached, but like there's a lot of secrecy around this. How did you train the models?
Well, there's a few dirty little secrets that I'll share with you at this point, I guess. First of all, that and the way that antivirus companies came to be, right? They would get access to a virus, and then they'd build a signature, and everyone else wouldn't have access to the virus, and then they'd promote it like, look, we're protected, by our product. And then the customers of these companies, these other antivirus companies, would say, well, gosh, why don't you have coverage of this virus? And then the next time that they get access to a virus and the other guy didn't get access, well, then they would withhold the signature from the other vendor, right? And at a point, you start to realize, wait, what are we doing here? Are we actually trying to prevent the bad guys from getting in, or are we just here to make money? And so what they said was they really came together in a partnership, early on, and said, look, if we get something, a sample submission, we're going to share it with you, and you're going to share it with us. And then that just started to blow up. So every single AV vendor out there, every researcher, every partner, to the point where then Virus Total was created, if you remember that, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So access to data was never really the problem. It was publicly available. It was shared quite freely. And of course, you had to, handle with care, and it wasn't going to go to, some bad guy out in, some foreign country without some credentials and validation. But once you're validated, yeah, absolutely, they would share it, and you could do whatever you wanted with the data because they were written by the bad guys.
Got it. Very cool. So, you have the unique insight now. You have a product now, but endpoint security is arguably incredibly competitive. Rather, obviously McAfee and Symantec, and there are a lot of vendors. So one of the you have to stand out as you message your approach and why is it unique, right? And you were ahead of your time. I remember going to RSA, and there was like 3 years whereby like just Cylance stood out among the herd. And you had this unique way to demonstrate the product. I believe you called it the Unbelievable Tour. Tell us about Cylance marketing. What made it great?
Well, of course, I had just a phenomenal team,
Yeah,
largely led with Ryan Golden, who was head of branding. I sort of plucked him out of his web development career, and he just had an incredible eye and
yeah,
an ability to understand complex topics and marketize it, sort of build a market around it. And so even though he was young at the time, he really just fell right into it. And when I started to explain, the book and the techniques and the company, it really started to make perfect sense to him. But we did struggle in the beginning with how do you demonstrate this thing? Because as you said, I mean, the endpoint market is insanely impacted
Yeah.
with, I mean, we were tracking at one point over 66 or 67 competitors in the endpoint space.
Gosh.
I mean, that's a lot of
Yeah.
competitors that you have to track on every single day, and so it's incredibly overpopulated, and so we struggle with how do you demonstrate this incredible technology that not only has the ability to prevent current attacks, but prevent all future attacks with no updating, right? Like that concept was just no one could really understand what that meant.
Yeah.
Like what is that? I don't even know what that means. I'm so used to having my regular updates, and I can't tell you how many times we do these pitch meetings, whatever. We'd explain it just like that every single time, and then say, "Okay, but how often do you guys update?" And we're like, "No, you don't get it. We never update. It never. You never have to update." Well, I don't understand. Like once a year? No, you never. Uh, because they're so brainwashed into thinking you have to get updates for detecting new stuff. So I was at a board meeting, and the board actually just point blank asked me, because they you were just blindly trusting me at that point. Like, Stu, what the heck are you creating? We don't even know what it is you're creating. And I said, look, I think the best way to tell you is to show you. I love live demos. I do it with the Hacking Exposed all the time. Let me just show you this. So that's exactly what I did. I took 100 current submitted samples in the last 24 hours from VirusTotal, and I just downloaded all of them, 100 of them, just to make it simple math, right? So 100 samples submitted to VirusTotal as brand new viruses in the last 24 hours that were PEs, so I could actually convert them to executables real easy by renaming them, and then I could run them real quickly in a for loop, and like one after the next, and let's see what happens. And I'll do it compared to my alma mater, at the time.
Mhm.
And I mean, of course, our technology was completely silent. You barely saw a blip on the CPU performance monitor graph, and then the other guys were literally melting down. I mean, it was blowing up. It was blue screening, and there's red screens everywhere, and you're like, "This is what we do." And there was no better way to show it, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, because it was real. It was tangible. People could get it right away. Like, wait, I have that. Or wait, I have a competitor of that. Does that also have the problem? And you're like, I'm glad you asked. Let me show you. And we would challenge, and we even pushed it so far to say, look, trust no vendor. That was a famous tagline of ours. Trust no vendor, because every vendor is going to tell you that they protect against all this. So don't trust any of us. Even us, don't trust us. Just test it for yourself. Do this exact test. Download VirusTotal, rename the PEs to executables, and run them in this for loop and see what happens on your standard gold build. And if you don't have Cylance, you need it.
Yeah. The technology sells for itself. Yeah.
It did. It did. Yeah. With that sort of real world demo, it really did.
For our listeners who are trying to build products in red oceans, this is a great way to market.
Yeah.
I'm going to now skip to or switch to company culture. One of the things that people who have not worked with you or don't know you is that you have great sense of value and worth, and you mentioned that you will never you should never forget your roots. How did that manifest itself in the company culture?
Well, I knew when I started Cylance that we had the potential to grow very, very quickly. If the technology did what we thought it could do, we knew it would scale fast. And I knew with great hyper growth like that, you have the potential to get cocky,
Yeah.
to have some hubris and to have humility take a back seat. And humility has been part of my life since I can remember. Getting beat up on the corner, getting beat up at school, like having to run for my life. Like, humility is a big part of my history and my world. And I just knew that, if you stay humble, if you stay focused, you won't be distracted. You'll be able to put all of your energy and effort into releasing and improving upon and innovating on great technology, and keeping those distractions to a minimum, which naturally occur from success. And so humility was always a big part of our culture. High integrity. If you say you're going to do something, you need to do it, or explain why you don't do it. You don't just ignore it. Um, and then, of course, I mean, my airplane experience drove me largely to want to prevent suffering, in my own little way, with cybersecurity and preventing hacks. I mean, look at all these ransomware attacks. I mean, it just kills me to see another ransomware attack work, because Cylance prevents all of them, like, forever and ever and ever. But obviously, we can't get that on every computer, so it just tortures me. So whenever I had the opportunity at Cylance, I would always, remind them, look, if you're not here to protect people, you shouldn't be here. Like, I'll find you another job. It's okay. I've got lots of friends that don't have this same passion and this same direction. So I'll find you another job, but you shouldn't be working here, because we're here to protect people, especially those that really can't fend for themselves and don't know how to protect themselves. So it was just the only way for me to be. It's the only way I know how to be, and the only way I know how to lead.
Yeah. What are the parts of the role, as a CEO? And I was reading profile of Frank Slootman, who's the CEO, a snowflake and legend in its own right in Bay Area. Is pretty intense guy, big believer in amping it up. And then obviously Ben Horowitz talks about wartime CEOs and peacetime CEOs. um, it sounded to me like, from your perspective, your style is mission driven, purpose driven, but that's not mutually exclusive on turning up the heat. Because in startup you're constantly in wartime. How did you manage and struggle with that sort of employees well-being, making sure that people are not getting burned out, versus it's wartime every day, day in and day out? Or was it sort of, once you decide the mission, people would actually work 12 hours, 15 hours a day towards that mission?
Well, it's a very astute observation. I mean, so what happens in the scenario in that I described is we get pretty much 90% of
Yeah.
every employee is passion and mission driven. So
Yeah.
they they will put in 300% over an individual that's just there for the paycheck, that would put in maybe 90%, which also um, sort of exacerbates the potential for them to burn out. And that was one of our big challenges at Silence, is we had a big burnout challenge. And so what I instituted a whole bunch of little things here and there, but one of the big things, was we offered, at a certain point in time, if you had been with us, we offered that many weeks off. So in the year, so it gave them an opportunity to really just totally unplug and uncheck for 4 or 5, 6 weeks, and still come back and have their job completely. And we also really encouraged healthy lifestyles and healthy eating and all the things that are really essential, mindfulness and all the things that are essential. I'm not saying we were perfect in that execution of it, because there were a lot of people that did burn out, but we did constantly try to learn from that and improve upon it. And yeah, it's a good point about startups. I mean, you are a wartime CEO every single day. There's no real, other way to put it. And it can create a lot of burnout. But you just got to remind everybody, look, slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah.
If we have to say no to a deal, it's okay. I know that's painful. I know it goes against the DNA code, but say no to a deal so you can live to see another day. You know,
Yeah.
you don't need to take every hill.
Yeah, it's a breath of fresh air to hear that from CEO, especially successful ones like yourself, because obviously, I was reading an article like, Goldman Sachs employees last, some of the junior ones, 100 hours a week, it just getting intense, more companies, more funding, it just go, go, go constantly. But
Hmm.
you're right. It's all about balance. So, you know, um, we can have like two parts just on company building itself, like various stages, 0 to 25 mil, 25 to 100, and etc. We're going to run out of time. So I do want to talk about the key thing about Cylance, which is, when you sold it for 1.4 billion, by any measure, incredible exit, right? Having said that, knowing what you know now post COVID, would you have rather taken the company public? Number one. And the reason why I ask is that obviously entrepreneurs often struggle between when to persist and when to exit.
Yeah.
What went into your thinking as you decided to exit when you did?
Well, for us, it had been 6 years, right? We started in July of 2012,
Yeah,
and we were on a roadshow to go public in July of 2018, as crazy as that sounds.
yeah,
And I believe we're still on record for the fastest cybersecurity company to 100 million in trailing revenue in history. And it even beat Palo Alto, I dare to say.
yeah,
So we knew we were on a great trajectory, but what we knew we couldn't do was we couldn't fulfill our ultimate mission, which is to protect everything under the sun without bringing together mobile, IoT, and sort of the interconnectedness of the
everything.
world and that platform. Because we were great at Windows, we were great at Mac, we were great at Linux, we were great at servers, you know, but we didn't have a mobile solution. We didn't have an IoT solution, and this technology is perfectly built for that. And we knew we couldn't do it all ourselves as well. So we said, when BlackBerry came along and knocked on our doors, their vision and their mission, with that Spark platform, really resonated with myself, the exec team, as well as the engineering team, that a 1+1 would equal 3. And so for me, absolutely, I'd do it all over again. The teams saw that alignment, saw that what it could really be, and ultimately what it can be, which is no one could cover that today, even to this day, from that complete coverage. It's just that simple. Certainly you've got the juggernaut companies out there, but they're all network, or they're all endpoint, or they're all cloud, or they're all IoT, but nobody can really offer up the expertise in all those areas. And so to do that, we knew we had to combine forces at some point. It was only be a question of would it be after IPO or before IPO.
Yeah.
And so no, we were just super happy to find that balance.
Yeah, great. So I'll switch to now basically for your fourth innings, so to speak, right? You've been an entrepreneur thrice in your career. Can you share some tips with our listeners on how to grow as a serial entrepreneur?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess my first suggestion is find something that you're super passionate about, like a problem that you want to fix. Find one problem, and the bigger the problem, the better. But find one problem that you really are passionate about fixing and solving, and then put everything into it that you can. And I don't mean money; I mean time. I mean, your interest, your passion, and then talk to people of like minds that want to solve the same problem, or that take on your problem as their own, and see if you can combine forces and build something that can solve that actual problem. Because even if you only reach half of where you want to go, if you go after a really big problem, you're probably going to be safe in terms of the market size and the solution that you're coming up with, or you'll iterate quickly. And the other thing is just to fail fast. And what I mean by fail fast, you guys have probably heard this many times, but for me, it means that you don't just try everything and then fail, quick, and then just change and pivot. You take a mindful approach to decision making, but once you make a decision, then you don't wait to change paths. Like, you'll know your backup path and your backup of your backup path, and you'll
Yeah.
switch quick. I can't tell you how many times I've seen companies, entrepreneurs fail who, keep doubling and tripling down on a really, really bad idea rather than just admit it's a bad idea and just moving on to the backup plan. Um, that's probably one of the most important suggestions I can provide people. And then, of course, the age-old maxim of just never giving up. That is really, showing up is the first job of winning. So showing up, staying on the field, and just continuing to chip away at the problem, no matter what the discouragement. I mean, you see a lot of people writing about entrepreneurs, and it's probably their stubbornness and their persistence that makes their success more than anything.
What about any advice on how to overcome the inner fear about starting your own company? What if I fail? What if things
Yeah.
don't work out? You were a serial entrepreneur. Like, were there ever fears in your mind when you started this? And what did you do to overcome those?
I think, I think you'd be lying as a human being if you said that you weren't fearful. I think there's always times and places in your life where there might be more fear than less fear. Like, when I started Foundstone, I started it literally 2 weeks before my firstborn was born. And that was only like 3 months after I had lost everything in this moving from the Bay Area down to LA. And so we had nothing. I mean, literally like air mattresses. It was crazy, right? And but I was also younger, and I also had already started a company and sort of made it a success. And so I'm like, yeah, I could do this again. This is cool, and it'll be software and stuff. So I sort of convinced myself and my wife at the time to look past all of that and just believe, just believe. But there are times, absolutely, where fear can take over, and I think what you have to just think about and introspect on yourself. There are certain personality types that don't that aren't impacted very much with fear because they know that they'll figure it out somewhere along the way. But there are others and they tend to be more precision driven, all right? They tend to be more precise. That means they need more predictability and more control. And you don't have a lot of control as an entrepreneur. You have very, very little, and very little predictability. And you sort of have to just believe in yourself and know that you will figure it out. And so I think surrounding yourself with people if you're not like that, surrounding yourself with people like that. I saw that in my father. My father started his own company out in Guam, and I didn't know it at the time, but now I realize, gosh, that was really hard. That had to have been really, really hard to do.
Yeah.
And somehow he did that. And I think to myself, gosh, my dad can do it. Why couldn't I do it? Right? Like, and so I think it's just surrounding yourself with people that can achieve those things and prove to you it's doable and that you can do it as well. And then just believing in yourself. And quite honestly, the secret is just never giving up. That's the bottom line.
Great. We are at the end of the pod. We'll switch to the rapid fire now.
Okay.
Single answers, yes or no, or descriptive, up to you. Um, First question: how would you explain Solar Storm to a 10-year-old?
Okay. So to a 4-year-old, this is it. All right. So a company created this product, this software, and somebody hacked that company. So when that company sent the software out to other people, they were also getting hacked.
Mm-hmm.
So it was sort of like your neighbor hacking you so that they could hack your family, because there was a level of trust that was there. So that was as good as I can get you. I mean,
Well,
for a 4-year-old.
well said.
Said. You're hired as a consultant for a top secret project at a large enterprise, bank maybe, and you're asked to advise on one threat vector that the enterprise should protect: network, endpoint, apps, identity, or data. What will you recommend?
Well, okay. It obviously would depend on what levels of defense and strength that they had already existing. But let's say they were all equal or all equally bad, let's say. My first and foremost defense that always needs to be fortified is the threat vector. So there's, identity vectors, threat vectors, and denial of service vectors, of basically classes of attacks. And threat-based attacks, vulnerability-based attacks tend to be the largest and easiest to exploit. Identity is shortly thereafter with reusable passwords and guessable passwords for sure, but that's getting better and better and better with controls on the back end side, and then denial of service would be the last. But it'd be threat prevention and threat detection as first and foremost.
Very
Great.
good.
Which mega trend represents the next $1 trillion market? Options: blockchain, crypto, AI, ML, AR, VR, climate, or healthcare?
From a cyber perspective, right?
Oh no, in general,
In
Oh,
general.
in general.
trillion-dollar big market.
Well, okay. I actually think democratizing healthcare.
Okay.
Agree. Your thoughts on Microsoft as a security vendor?
My thoughts on Microsoft as a security vendor. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, first of all, I think that they have done more as an operating system vendor than anyone else on the planet for cybersecurity. I just want that to be clear.
Hmm.
And they have incredibly strong talent of people and individuals, and quite frankly, technology. And they were one of the only companies out there as a competitor that we actually lost sleep over. It wasn't CrowdStrike or anybody else. It was Microsoft because of their stranglehold, if you will, on the enterprise and the mid-market for their software. However, I think you could poke a lot of holes in them. Obviously, we could beat them up pretty good. But at the end of the day, they've responded and risen to almost every challenge and problem that we've thrown at them. And for that, I give them a passing grade. And I think that they've done well.
What are you reading currently?
Well, here you go. I'm trying to finish my buddy's book called The Peacemaker's Code.
Yeah.
I don't know if you see that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Deepak Malhotra. Yeah.
Yeah, Deepak is a dear friend of mine, and he's a professor at Harvard with negotiations. And he decided over COVID, he's like, look, I'm bored out of my mind. I'm going to write a book. And I'm like, sounds great to me. So I helped, preview it. I got through probably half, 2/3, and I just got to finish the rest. But it looks like a really good book to finish up on.
I'm going to add it to my list. And last questions to who should we have next on the pod?
Well, I think you said it. Dave DeWalt would be fantastic. You get Dave on here. He would do it in a heartbeat, and he's such a good guy. And he'll tell you some great stories. And ask him how he got the name for Night Dragon, because I reminded him where he got it from.
We will absolutely do that.
Yeah.
With that, Stu, thank you. We just enjoyed the pod so much. Thank you for the time and your wisdom.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can, have you in the pod in a year again.
Yeah, have me as a repeat guest. Sounds like fun.
By the way, I was going to ask you, do you have a Twitter handle or something where people can follow your work? What's the best way for people to reach out to you?
On LinkedIn is usually the best.
Okay. Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Stuart. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.